One of the questions I always have when I see a speaker up on the stage is, why are they there? And the reason why I'm here is because I fundamentally believe in the importance of innovation for Australia and for Australia's future. There's one fact which sort of makes clear why that is so important. 3 companies, Amazon, Google and Facebook, have a market capitalisation which is greater than the entire Australian ASX listed companies. So in 20 years, 3 technology companies have created more value as listed entities than Australia has created in 200 years. 4 of the top 5 most valuable companies in the world are all technology companies. We can get a little bit complacent about these issues in Australia. We talk about innovation, we talk about us being an innovative nation and innovative people. But the reality is, in terms of actually translating that into the jobs of the future and the companies of the future, we've not done nearly as well. So the reason why I'm here is that I believe in the critical importance of doing that. The good news is that at least at a theoretical level, we have embraced the idea of innovation as being important. So this conference, other conferences like this in Sydney, in Brisbane, Perth and other places indicate that we do understand the nature of the problem. The challenge a little bit is actually going from that theoretical understanding to actually how do you start giving birth to the new companies and how do you support those companies and how do those companies support themselves as they develop. And there's lots of things which need to be done there. But one of those things is actually learning from companies which have already established themselves. So I'm here actually to try and share some of the learnings which I have from the companies I've been involved in. So what are those companies? First of all, there was LookSmart. It was the first, I think, Australian technology company to list on the NASDAQ. At one stage, it was worth more than Qantas. It no longer is. It no longer exists. The second company, as was mentioned, is Aconex. I was the chairman of Aconex, listed company on the Australian Stock Exchange worth just under $1 billion. I think it must have now about 700 or 800 employees based out of Melbourne with offices all around the world, a great company. And finally, RedBubble, which I'm the co-founder and CEO of. So RedBubble now is just on 12 years old, started in 2006, 11 years old. So I'm going to draw from the experience drawn out of those 3 companies. The first thing I'm going to say, this is a Yeah-Nah conference, and so I've got to talk about the lessons, the negative lessons which were learned. I'm going to sort of acknowledge right up front that most of those come out of my experience at LookSmart. LookSmart was a good company. It was a product of its time. It started in 1995. We were swept up in that whole wave around the Web 1.0. And as I came out of that experience after 2001 and returned to Australia, I reflected back on it and I thought, well, LookSmart had done some great things. Probably, most importantly from my point of view, a few people had got some money out of the whole thing. But it actually wasn't a company of enduring value. And as I think about that idea, the fundamental idea of how do you go from companies which are just sort of, flash in the pan to companies which really do create value, the companies which look like the Googles or the Facebooks or the Amazon, I think there are some real lessons which come out of that, and those are some of the lessons which I also try to apply at Aconex and RedBubble. So I'm going to try and extract those out and hope those are useful for you. A little bit about RedBubble. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with it. It is worth noting, though, RedBubble, I think, is the largest global consumer internet company to come out of Australia. You need all of those adjectives in order for it to make sense. But RedBubble gets about 11 million visits a month. We did $175 million of sales last year. We're still growing at 30% per year, and we're entirely a consumer audience. And 94% of all of those sales are offshore. Australia has had some very good successes with B2B companies, Aconex being one example, but you could go on, Atlassian being another example. Envato is sort of a B2B company, largely a B2B company. It's got sort of different aspects to it, but it largely is. We've not had nearly as much success with consumer tech companies. And they're very valuable consumer tech companies because they actually are a window, an open window into what's actually happening within technology itself. And so they actually create the energy for most people around what's possible. I'm very excited by Aconex, I'm terribly excited by Envato and Atlassian, but I can't explain them to my mum. Whereas RedBubble is actually transparent what we do, and so it does create a certain energy around it. Just to give some context of the scale of which RedBubble operates, there's 600,000 artists on RedBubble. There's about 11 million images. We're now fulfilling fulfillment partners in 24 locations all around the world, 64 different product types. And last year, we had just under 3 million customers. Those all sound like they're biggish numbers, I think, but they're nowhere near where we want to be. So the big markets RedBubble operates in is essentially about 500 million customers in North America and Europe, which is where we are, in German, French, and Spanish. And when I think about 3 million customers, I think that's big, but I also think that 500 million is a lot bigger, and so the aspiration is very much towards those 500 million. Just as I talk about RedBubble, it's also worth noting the particular wave which is driving RedBubble, and it's a real transformation as consumers are going to on-demand retail. That's where products are created for the customer at the point of order. On-demand retail is part of this sort of larger phenomena. You can think of Uber as a part of that phenomena in many respects. Airbnb is a part of that phenomena. But it's really the breakdown of mass merchandising and mass marketing and mass production into much smaller units. And RedBubble is part of that, where things are very much created for the customer at point of order. And that's a fundamental wave which is driving that. And we've harnessed that wave through our relationship with the artists and then also our relationship with the fulfillers globally. Those are just to give you a sense of how that would work. If you were to order a product right now, a piece of apparel from RedBubble, if you were to order that today, that would be being manufactured in Brisbane today, and it would get to you, can't get to you on Saturday or Sunday because of Australia Post, but it would get to you on Monday or Tuesday. And that's a remarkable thing, a single product for a single customer at the time of order. And that's the technology innovation which RedBubble is part of. But we didn't invent any of that, we simply brought it all together. Anyway, I want to go, as I said, I wanted to talk about the experiences out of LookSmart. And one way of talking about that is the very first iterations of RedBubble. Because we didn't actually begin exactly where we are, like so many companies. We began somewhere else. And this is the very, very first design for RedBubble. One of my co-founders, Paul Van Zeller, was fortunately a designer, so we did design early. And what it was a version of what sites like Cafe Press and others, where you could come along and you could upload images which you had created, and then you could buy them for yourself. So that was the first design, and we had a group of us, about 8 of us, looked at this, and we really hated it. It just didn't resonate with us at all. We said we wouldn't use this, and so we went back and we improved it, and we turned it into a dog. It was, doing exactly the same thing, exactly the same design, but I'm not sure it's getting fundamentally better. It's still doing the same thing. So we said and there was a group of us, designers and others, and we went back and we then thought about it again, and so we actually then changed it. And we put the woman and the dog together. These are the small iterations, and we're not getting any closer to success, really, are we? But what was happening at this point was interesting, because we were trying to refine what we truly wanted to do. And the reason why these weren't working for us is they didn't resonate with us. They weren't the thing which we as people actually wanted to bring into the world. And my key lesson here ultimately is, at least for the early stage startup, it's got to come deep from a sense of yourself, or what impact you want to have on the world. And this didn't resonate with us because we didn't think of ourselves as consumers. And even though we could say, well, we could imagine that theoretical consumer who could be buying from this company, it wasn't us, and we didn't want, and so it didn't have that motivation to actually keep us going. And so we went from that, and that was actually the primary lesson which I took out of the LookSmart experience. LookSmart, in one way, was always built for somebody else. And I said to myself, I'm never going to spend the next 5 or 6 or 10 years of my life doing something for somebody else. It has to be fundamentally for ourselves. And so we then said, what we really we're interested in is creating something which had artists at the heart of it, and we wanted to create a marketplace for those artists. And so we flipped on its head the idea of who was our first customer. And our first customer was not the person who was buying, but the person who was selling. If you're starting a marketplace, you can start on either side, actually. You can start with the customer, but we decided the place where we wanted to start was with the artist, because that was who we thought of ourselves as, and that was what we wanted to bring into the world. And so while this was coming at it from a customer perspective, we wanted to come at it from an artist perspective. And the real critical importance of that is that that single idea has become was the North Star for RedBubble. And throughout all of the changes and all that consumer wave which I was talking about, we didn't have any idea of what that was. There are other changes, the technology has changed, all of those things have changed. But the single idea of what we're actually about was at the heart of the company, and we put that at the heart of the company from the very beginning. A few years ago, the idea of pivoting was very popular idea. You could pivot from one thing to another thing. You could pivot from a company doing this one day to somebody doing something fundamentally different the other day. I think pivoting has fallen a little bit out of favour. I haven't heard it for a while, but this was the only pivot we've ever done as a company, and it was a pivot from deciding who was at the heart of the company, and we decided it was the artist, and that held us true. And I think that when I think of great founders like Zuckerberg or Bezos or Steve Jobs, I think that they have, and what they bring into the company is the idea of the single idea or the single concept which doesn't actually change and allows the company to endure over time. And the rest of what I'm going to talk about is how you then build out that idea. So there's 3 things I wanted to specifically talk about. 3 lessons learned, they're both the yeahs and the nahs. The right target, the right action, and the right actors. And as I say, these provide, to my mind, the North Star for a company. Let's talk about the right target. And at the first thing, and I've just dwelled on, is clarity of who your customer is. When I think about Look Smart, you could have gone around the offices, we had 500 employees, and you could have asked those employees what we did as a company, and they would have had different views. But you could have even asked them who the customer was, and you would have probably got 4 or 5 different answers about who the customer actually was. The right answer, actually, at that time, was our real customer was the investors. Those are the people who were doing the deals for. Those are the people who were actually doing all this stuff for. As we were along with everybody else involved in this game of pumping up and creating a sort of a value, but it was really around the investors. In the case of RedBubble, we've had this real clarity that the artists are our first customers. We have over time got much greater clarity of how we serve their needs and how the consumer is also part of our customer base, but we've never lost sight of that. And having clarity about who your first and foremost customer is really important. Media companies get very tricky about these sorts of issues, and certainly if you're in the media business, trying to think about who your customer is quite tricky, and even Facebook has had challenges around it. But that clarity about who the customer is and how you're creating value is the first starting point. And following from this is this clarity of purpose. It's interesting in RedBubble's case, we never wrote down our purpose or our mission. We didn't write it down for years and years. In fact, I wrote it down. It took me to actually get the right words out. We had a version relatively early on, within 18 months. But it was never necessary to write it down. We were all in the same room screaming at each other. And so the purpose was so well understood and so deeply embedded in who we were as an organisation, it wasn't necessary for it to be written down. It became necessary only to write it down as we got bigger, and we had other people who were more distant from the sort of that angry room. In fact, that angry room began to get split up, and we were all over the world. But that clarity of purpose, we then did need to write it down and constantly go back to it. If you are in an early stage company, would probably advise you not to get writing your purpose down too quickly, because it it should be more deeply embedded than that. And finally, the clarity of economics. RedBubble always knew how we were going to make money. We always understood what the margins were. We always understood that you couldn't make up on volume what you lost in margin. That was just going out of business more quickly. And it is a bit of a myth in Australia that US companies don't have clarity of their economics. It's actually a myth. You know, Uber, actually at some level, people do actually run the ruler over it and see how this company will make money in the future. They do actually understand that Amazon, with 40% of the e-commerce market, even though it's not making money at the moment, is actually a really valuable company because of the fundamental nature of their economics. So making sure your economics actually work is pretty important. That's the right target. Secondly, the right action. Steve Jobs, when he came back to Apple, would talk about the fact that the hardest thing was saying no. It's really easy to say yes to lots of things, and that's where actually, and particularly in a startup, you know, I think of being in a startup as being sort of in the cockpit of an aircraft. There's an awful lot of information coming at you. There's an awful lot of dials. You've got headphones on and people screaming information at you, turn left, turn right, up, down, all of this sort of stuff. And actually getting the signal from that noise is actually quite tricky. And so the right action, and this is what I'm talking about here, is how do you get the right action? The first thing is you have to have value-based decisions. If you don't have value-based decisions, you're really not going to get there. Now, and I'll give you one example perhaps. In the case of RedBubble, because we understood that our artists were, or the artists were at the heart of what we did, you know, people come to me all the time and say, well, why don't you do X or Y? For example, have the artists pay for higher placement in the research rankings, or put advertising on the site. I don't need to run the economics of that. Don't need to, not necessary. I just simply know it's the wrong thing to do. It's in contrast, it conflicts with our fundamental belief in what's important, and that's in nurturing the artists. So that's actually a values-based at that level. Lots of other decisions get value-based. We now actually have written out our values. It took us actually 11 years to write them out. That's okay, but we did understand early on what those values were at a fundamental level, and we're able to make decisions based upon that. The second part of this is actually agile systems. I'm not really talking about the technology of agile, which I do understand and appreciate, and we've certainly had that at RedBubble, but I'm really talking about systems which have rapid cycle times. And probably more important, as rapid a cycle time as you can get. And generally that cycle time is more rapid than you thought it was, unless it isn't. And there are times when it's not rapid, and you have to acknowledge that. If you're replacing your accounting system, you're going to have to replace your accounting system, and you're going to be in a deep waterfall process, and it's going to be painful, and you've got to acknowledge it's going to take you 12 months or something to do it. That's okay. That's as rapid a cycle time as you can probably get if you're replacing your accounting system. Other things, though, people will come to you and say, oh, it's going to take us 12 months before we get. Really think about how you can break it down into more rapid cycle times, because each cycle is you get more information, you learn more, and you can adapt. And finally, and that really comes out of that, is this sort of learning processes. Learning is actually hard and it's painful, and if it isn't, then it's probably nothing was really learnt in general. If you accept that it is hard and that it's going to be painful, you're actually ahead of the curve, because then you actually say, well, how do we learn the hard lessons? How do we learn the things which are actually going to cost us? How do we learn the things which are not obvious? And that's where learning systems and processes come in. So I'm keeping this simple. It's a big number 3. So the right actors. There's a really good book. There's a number of, obviously there's been some good business books read. I haven't read most of them, that's okay. But one I have read is Good to Great. And Good to Great talks about the fact that getting the right people on the bus early is really important. It's tricky in a startup because you're going to have churn or not churn's not a nice way of framing. You will get people into your organisation and they will serve the organisation well for a time and then move on. That's absolutely fine. That's a normal part of it. But it's getting the right people into the organisation at the right time is really important. And the things which are continuous for that, or anybody at any time, is firstly a commitment to the purpose of the company. If people aren't committed to the purpose of the company, I honestly ask, why are you here? You know, you're here for the stock options, you're here because you think it's a cool environment, but that's not good enough. It has to be commitment to purpose. And if you can't define your purpose sufficiently clearly in order to identify whether the person you're recruiting is committed to it, you've got a problem actually. Secondly is energy. Startups are hard work, early stage companies are hard work, and people need to have the energy to go through with it. And it's just, and energy is not working, 15-hour days. I actually don't believe in that. I don't think I've ever really done it maybe I'm lazy, I don't know. But anyway, what it actually is that you can continue at something for a period of time. You don't get sort of put off by the hardship which you'll go through. And I can remember times at RedBubble, I come in on a Monday morning early on and I'd be sitting in the car saying, oh, another week. You know, it would be easy to think of just driving away, but because this was in the sort of the valley of death all marketplaces have, and you're going to be often in those situations for relatively long periods of time. And so having the energy to go on is really important. Skills and experience, it actually changes over time with companies, but it's pretty obvious. We underestimated the value of skills, and sometimes you actually do need people with serious skills in your organisation and acknowledge what you don't know. So when we actually brought in somebody into logistics at RedBubble, it actually made a pretty big difference for a company which is actually, you know, all of our customer value proposition was logistics based, so that was an example. And finally, diversity. Diversity is sort of popular at the moment. For me, diversity is fundamentally about making better decisions. You know, small groups of huddled white blokes in, you know, not smoke-filled, Red Bull-filled rooms don't make good decisions. You know, you need the people who've got bringing different experiences to bear on that, and that's across the whole thing. And if you don't, and diversity is really about making sure you have that, and you have an environment which is genuinely welcoming of that diversity. And it's easy to say we're diverse because we are recruiting for X, Y, or Z, but it's much more important to say, okay, what is the environment we're actually creating for it? And this is actually where learning is hard, because it's one of the areas where learning is hard. You are going to have to do things differently in order to have a genuinely diverse workforce and diverse board. Finally, as we begin to wrap up, this is from Emily Dickinson. She said, luck is not chance, it's toil, fortune's expensive smile is earned. I think Winston Churchill said it even more simply, never, 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 never give up. And if you don't give up, eventually you'll get lucky. So there is you've got to be a bit careful with this, because some ideas are so bad that they should have been abandoned pretty early on. So do take some advice. If enough people tell you it's rubbish, it probably is rubbish. But that said, if you also get enough people who believe in it, then it's actually a question of really committing. And then and eventually, if you do that, you'll get lucky. And one of the interesting things, as you get lucky, people will sit back and say, "Oh, it was just luck," and then you try not to correct them, because you know the luck just comes by being there eventually. And this is, I've got this down as a nah, but it actually should be a yah. It's tough. You will massively screw up. Every single startup will do something fundamentally wrong at various times. I should actually probably adjust that adjective. If it was fundamentally wrong, you wouldn't be around, but it's pretty wrong. And so we've done some things which were pretty wrong at RedBubble. And you look at them and you say, how did I waste that amount of time doing that thing when I could have been doing something which was useful? You think of Google, you think of Facebook, you think of Amazon, you think of all the things they've started which have not gone on. Every single company has this, and you'll have it as a startup. Those things look like screw-ups after the event. They're actually often learning opportunities though. And the one reason, and I think this is where it's important, avoiding the fundamentally wrong, the thing which actually does you in, is actually by getting those first three things right. And the first three of those three things, the most important is who is your customer and how is you serving them. So I've seen, you know, the companies which have gone wrong in our space, and the reason why we're the global leader in our space, even though about 5 companies started at the same time, is that they didn't put the artists at the heart of their experiences, and they did something along the way which really alienated them from the artists. I won't name those companies, but I could. And because we didn't do that, we didn't actually screw the thing up, and that's kept us right. But we did a lot of other things wrong, but they didn't. We'll call those learning opportunities. And finally, there's just 2 things which I'll share with you. Just things which are worth bearing in mind and maybe reflecting on. I'm not sure that these are probably a bit Zen elliptic, actually. I'm not sure that they can, you know, they don't turn them so well. But over time, eventually the brand which you have externally will reflect your culture internally, and the culture you have internally will eventually be reflected in your brand. You can create this sort of fake brand on top, which you layer on top of your company. But if you're Patagonia, and if you don't actually have rock climbers and mountain climbers in the organisation who actually understand that, eventually quickly people begin to think, actually Patagonia is not really a serious brand, it's actually just a, sort of another clothing brand which isn't doing what it says. In RedBubble's case, we've really embraced this idea of making sure that the notion of the artist flows through all of what we do in creativity. And perhaps even a little bit more obscurely, strategy in some sense follows process. There's a bit of a tendency to think of strategy as something which you come up with sort of abstractly. I think good processes internally eventually leads to good strategy. And it doesn't, you know, and more importantly, good strategy in this sense is deeply embedded in the organisation. I've got final questions, and the dog answers questions. The one other thought I'll leave with you is think about governance early on. It's easy to ignore it, but it is important.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Martin. We've got just time for one question from the audience.
One question.
Yeah, but it's a big one.
Yeah.
How do you grow a two-sided marketplace in the early days?
And we had Cyan here earlier. And Collis and Vado have talked about this, and there's other marketplaces here in Melbourne. The answer is you have to, the way in which I think about it is you've got, in the size of the marketplace, you need to have, in your ideal two-sided marketplace, you have very low customer acquisition costs and very high customer retention, and you have very low artist acquisition costs and very low seller costs and very high seller retention. That's your perfect model. And if those are sufficiently well positioned, the marketplace can get going relatively quickly organically, eBay being an example of that. Most of us don't have that luxury, and so we have to buttress one side of the marketplace. In our case, because we had focused on the artists, we were then able to focus a lot of it because the artists came organically, and we did a lot of work just to nurture an environment where they were happy to be, even though they weren't selling. We then could spend a lot of time focusing on the consumers. I know other marketplaces go about it differently, and they'll say, well, we can get, for example, we can get demand, and then the sellers will come. And it just depends upon where the gap is in the market and what you're particularly filling. Over time, you end up doing both. You end up doing a little bit of work on sellers, a little bit of work on the buyers, sellers, buyers, sellers, buyers. But in those early days, you've got to have at least one side of the market which is really, really, really needing your service, because they'll tolerate the market failure which exists. And I don't know whether Cyan specifically referred to this. I know Collis has in Envato's case. You know, they had one side of the marketplace which was particularly those people seeking themes, as I understand it, which meant that they were really prepared to. They could build the artists put a lot of effort into building the seller's side. We had the other side. We were able to leave the artists to look after themselves for a while. We put a lot of effort into community for them as we went on the consumers. But it really depends on what sort of marketplace you have. But you can't start a marketplace. You cannot start a marketplace unless there's one side which doesn't have a real need. A real crying need, a hair on fire need, something they have to address. But you can start it if only one side has that. Both sides don't absolutely have to have it.
Well, thank you, Martin, for joining us, and join me in thanking Martin.
You're welcome.